The air in the Senate chamber was suffocating. Every breath felt weighted with expectation, with history about to break. It wasn't supposed to be like this. A routine hearing on government transparency had transformed into something else entirely, something America would never forget. The cameras had already found their angles. Journalists sat forward in their seats, pens ready, sensing blood in the water. And at the center of it all sat two men, one smirking, one silent, one about to speak words that would shatter everything. Vice President J.D. Vance sat motionless in the witness chair, his hands folded on the table before him. His face revealed nothing. No anger, no fear, just a stillness that unnerved the room. Across from him, Congressman Adam Schiff leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it. He thought he knew how this would end. "Mr. Vice President," Schiff began, his voice dripping with theatrical courtesy, "thank you for joining us today." He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "Though I must confess I'm somewhat puzzled by your presence here. After all, what exactly does a vice president do beyond attending funerals and breaking ties in the Senate?" Muffled laughter rippled through the chamber. A few senators shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but not yet alarmed. Schiff's smile widened. He was enjoying this. JD didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on Schiff, unblinking, calm. The congressman continued, emboldened by the silence. "I mean, really, Mr. Vance. You've written books about struggling communities, about the forgotten American. Yet here you sit, in the second most powerless position in Washington, while those same communities continue to suffer. One has to wonder, do you ever ask yourself what you're actually accomplishing?" The room grew quieter. This wasn't just political theater anymore. This was personal, vicious, the kind of public humiliation that ended careers. Reporters began typing furiously. The camera operators zoomed in on JD's face, searching for a crack, a flinch, anything. But there was nothing, just that same unsettling calm. Behind the glass partition of the viewing gallery, President Donald Trump sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Barron Trump leaned forward slightly, his young eyes locked on the scene below. He had never seen anything like this. Neither had America. Schiff pressed on, mistaking silence for weakness. "Perhaps if you had spent less time on your hillbilly memoir and more time studying constitutional law, you might understand the gravity of your inadequacy." More laughter, louder now, some of it nervous, some of it cruel. Schiff was performing, and he knew it. He was dismantling a vice president on live television, and he believed himself untouchable. J.D. Vance blinked slowly. Once. Then he reached down beside his chair and lifted a simple manila folder onto the table. The movement was unhurried, almost gentle. He opened the folder and pulled out a single document, official letterhead, government seal. He placed it carefully on the table, his fingers smoothing the edges. The room began to sense something, a shift, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air itself changes. Schiff's smile flickered just for a second. "What's that?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "More talking points from your staff. A resignation letter, perhaps." JD looked up. His eyes met Schiff's directly. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, devastatingly quiet. Every microphone in the room strained to catch it. "While you mock my role, Congressman Schiff," JD said, each word measured and precise, "your name appears on this document. It's a federal audit report. And it shows that you personally diverted $12 million in COVID relief funds into offshore accounts controlled by shell companies registered to members of your family." The silence that followed was absolute. Not a breath, not a whisper, just stunned, crushing silence. Then chaos. Senators leapt to their feet. Journalists shouted questions. The committee chairman slammed his gavel again and again, the sound lost in the eruption. Adam Schiff's face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. JD remained seated, unmoved by the storm around him. He slid the document forward across the table toward the committee chairman. "This isn't political theater," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is evidence, federal evidence. And every American deserves to know what was done with money meant to save their businesses, their livelihoods, their families." Schiff finally found his voice, but it came out strangled, desperate. This is fabrication, lies. How did you? JD interrupted him, still calm, still quiet. I received this from a former member of your staff, a whistleblower who came to me 3 weeks ago, crying, unable to live with what he had helped you hide. He brought documentation, bank records, wire transfer receipts, emails in your own hand. All of it has been verified by the Treasury Department's Office of Inspector General. The chamber erupted again. Phones buzzed. News alerts screamed across millions of screens nationwide. Breaking news. Vice President exposes Schiff in live testimony. 12 million in COVID funds allegedly stolen. Career over. In the gallery, President Trump's expression finally changed. The faintest smile touched his lips. Barron whispered something to his father, eyes wide with amazement. Trump nodded once, slowly. Adam Schiff tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. He gripped the armrests of his chair, his entire body trembling. This is a setup, he managed. A partisan witch hunt designed to, JD cut him off again, his tone still maddeningly gentle. No, Congressman, this is accountability, something you've avoided for far too long. He pulled another document from the folder. This is a wire transfer authorization. $500,000 sent from a federal emergency relief account to a business called Horizon Strategic Consulting. That business is registered in your wife's maiden name. It has no employees, no office, no phone number. It exists only to receive money. Money that was supposed to help struggling restaurants in California stay open. Money that was supposed to keep nurses employed during the worst health crisis of our lifetime. The room gasped again. Several senators put their heads in their hands. One began openly weeping. Schiff's mouth moved soundlessly like a fish drowning in air. JD continued, relentless now but still quiet, still calm. You did this while small business owners were losing everything, while families were being evicted, while nurses were reusing masks because hospitals couldn't afford supplies. You stole from them, Congressman. You stole their hope. In Ohio, a woman named Rebecca Martinez sat frozen in her living room, watching the television through tears. Her restaurant had closed 18 months ago. She'd applied for relief funding 3 times and been denied each time. Now she knew why. The money had been stolen. Stolen by the man who had promised to help people like her. In a hospital break room in Nevada, 2 nurses stood side by side, watching the hearing on a small wall-mounted TV. Neither spoke. One covered her mouth with her hand. The other just stared, tears streaming down her face. They had worked 16-hour shifts in makeshift PPE, watching patients die, being called heroes while struggling to pay rent. And the money that could have helped them had been stolen. Back in the Senate chamber, Adam Schiff finally managed to stand. His face was red now, rage replacing shock. I demand a recess, he shouted, his voice cracking. This is a kangaroo court. This is a political assassination. The committee chairman, visibly shaken, raised his hand. Congressman Schiff, you will have the opportunity to respond, but first. JD interrupted, standing now for the first time. He wasn't tall, but in that moment he seemed to tower over everyone. There's more, he said. The room fell silent again, waiting, dreading. The audit also revealed payments to a nonprofit called American Futures Initiative, another shell organization. This one received $8 million. It was supposed to fund small business training programs in underserved communities, but no programs were ever created. No businesses were ever trained. The money simply disappeared into accounts in the Cayman Islands. He paused, letting the weight of it settle. The director of American Futures Initiative is your nephew, Congressman. A 24-year-old with no business experience who drives a Maserati and lives in a penthouse in Manhattan. All purchased within 6 months of receiving that $8 million. Pandemonium, total, absolute pandemonium. Reporters rushed the doors, senators were shouting. Security guards moved forward, unsure what to do, and through it all J.D. Vance stood perfectly still, watching Adam Schiff crumble before him. Schiff tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but his words came out in broken fragments. I wasn't, that's not. J.D. picked up the folder and walked slowly toward the committee chairman. He placed it on the desk in front of him. Everything is documented in here, he said quietly. Bank statements, shell company registration forms, email correspondence, Sworn affidavits from 3 former staff members. This isn't a political hit job. This is the truth, and the American people deserve to know it. He turned back to face Schiff. You stood there moments ago and mocked me, mocked my background, mocked the people I come from. But those people, Congressman, they are the ones you stole from. The coal miners, the factory workers, the single mothers working 2 jobs. You took money meant for them and bought yourself luxury and power. And you did it while lecturing the rest of us about morality and justice. Adam Schiff collapsed back into his chair. His aide rushed to his side, whispering urgently, but Schiff just stared straight ahead, his eyes unfocused. The fight had left him. All that remained was the terrible, crushing realization that it was over. His career, his reputation, everything. JD returned to his seat. The chamber slowly, painfully quieted. The chairman cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. We will recess for 1 hour while the committee reviews this evidence. Congressman Schiff, you are advised to consult with legal counsel. The gavel fell, but no one moved. Everyone just sat there, stunned, trying to process what they had just witnessed. As the room finally began to empty, a young Senate intern, a girl from rural Kentucky, approached JD quietly. Her eyes were red. My dad, she whispered. My dad owned a hardware store. He applied for relief. He was denied. 6 months later, he had to close. He cried when he locked the door for the last time. I've never seen my dad cry before. She paused, swallowing hard. Thank you for saying what no one else would. JD placed a hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak. What could he say? The damage was already done. The pain already inflicted. All he could do was expose it, make sure it was seen. In the gallery, as people filed out, an elderly veteran named Martin Reeves stood slowly, using his cane for support. He had served in Vietnam. He had seen corruption before. But this cut deep. He caught JD's eye as the vice president walked past and gave him a single, sharp salute. JD returned it. Then he left the chamber alone, walking down the long marble hallway as the voices and chaos faded behind him. In his office, he sat down heavily in his chair and closed his eyes. His phone was already exploding with messages. News outlets, politicians, friends, enemies. He ignored all of it. Instead, he thought about Rebecca in Ohio, about the nurses in Nevada, about the intern's father and his hardware store. He thought about all the people who would never know he had done this for them. Outside his window, the sun was setting over Washington. The city glowed golden and red, beautiful, deceptive. He wondered if anything would really change, if this moment would matter, or if the machine would simply grind on, indifferent and unstoppable. Then his assistant knocked softly and entered. Sir, she said quietly, there are people outside, a lot of people. JD stood and walked to the window. Below on the Capitol steps, a crowd had gathered. Not protesters, not angry mobs, just people, holding candles, holding signs. Some said, "Thank you, JD." Others said, "Truth matters." They weren't chanting or shouting. They were just standing there, silent, bearing witness. And for the first time that day, JD Vance felt something break inside him, not in a bad way, in a necessary way. He pressed his hand against the glass and whispered, "I'm sorry it took so long." The night deepened. The crowd grew. And somewhere in a small apartment in California, Rebecca Martinez lit a candle of her own and placed it in her window. She didn't know if anyone would see it, but she needed to do something. To acknowledge that for once someone had fought for her. The fallout came swiftly. Within hours, the major networks had shifted their entire programming. Every channel showed the same clip. JD Vance, calm and unshakable, delivering that single sentence. While you mock my role, Congressman Schiff, your name appears on this document. It played on loop, in airports, in diners, in homes across every state. And each time it played, people stopped what they were doing and watched. In a prison rec room in Texas, inmates crowded around the television. One of them, a man serving time for fraud, shook his head slowly. Man knew he was walking into a trap, he muttered. But he walked in anyway, that's real. In a Wall Street trading floor, brokers paused mid-deal to watch the testimony. One of them, a woman who had clawed her way up from nothing, wiped her eyes discreetly. That's what it looks like when someone actually gives a damn, she said to no one in particular. Back in Washington, the machinery of justice began to turn. The committee reconvened after the recess, but Adam Schiff did not return. His attorney appeared instead, stone-faced, and read a brief statement. Congressman Schiff denies all allegations and will vigorously defend himself against these baseless accusations. The attorney refused questions and left immediately. But the damage was done. The evidence was public. The audit report had been leaked to every major news organization within minutes. By morning, the Washington Post ran a full front-page story. The New York Times followed. Even international outlets picked it up. American Vice President exposes massive corruption. The details were damning. Wire transfers to fake companies, lavish purchases made by Schiff's relatives, emails discussing how to hide the money, all of it meticulously documented, all of it undeniable. In Congress, the mood was somber. Democrats scrambled to distance themselves. Republicans smelled blood, but J.D. Vance did neither. He released a single statement. This isn't about politics. It's about accountability. Every American who suffered during the pandemic deserves to know where their tax dollars went. This is just the beginning of that reckoning. The Justice Department announced an official investigation within 48 hours. The FBI opened a file. Treasury investigators began tracing every dollar. And Adam Schiff, for the first time in his career, was utterly silent. He canceled all public appearances. His office stopped returning calls. He became a ghost. But America was not silent. Social media exploded. The hashtag Truth Matters trended for 3 straight days. People shared their stories. A restaurant owner in Georgia who had lost everything. A nurse in Florida who had worked without adequate PPE. A teacher in Michigan whose school had closed permanently. Each of them tagged J.D. Vance, thanking him, blessing him, telling him their pain. J.D. read every single message. Late at night, alone in his office, he scrolled through hundreds, then thousands of posts. He saw faces, heard voices, felt the weight of their suffering. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, the full magnitude of what Schiff had done. This wasn't just financial corruption. This was betrayal on a human scale. These were real lives destroyed, real families shattered. One message stopped him cold. It was from a woman named Jennifer Cole. The profile picture showed her with 2 young children. The message was simple. My husband killed himself after his business failed. We had applied for relief and been denied. He felt like he had failed us, but he didn't fail. The system failed him. Thank you for showing us it wasn't his fault. J.D. stared at the screen for a long time. Then he closed his laptop, put his head in his hands and wept. Not for himself, not for his victory, but for Jennifer's husband, whose name he would never know. For the man who had died believing he wasn't good enough when the truth was that the system had been rigged against him all along. The next morning, J.D. requested a meeting with the Attorney General. It was granted immediately. They met in a secure room, no press, no cameras. J.D. brought the full file, every document, every affidavit, every scrap of evidence his team had compiled. This can't be the end, J.D. said quietly. Schiff isn't the only one. This goes deeper. The Attorney General, a stern woman named Patricia Morales, nodded slowly. We know. We've been building cases for months, but we needed someone to break the dam. You did that. She paused, studying him. This won't make you popular in certain circles. You understand that? J.D. met her gaze. I'm not here to be popular. Patricia smiled faintly. Good, because what comes next is going to be ugly. Over the following weeks, the investigation widened. More names emerged. Other members of Congress, staffers, lobbyists. The web of corruption was vast, intricate, and deeply entrenched. But now it was exposed, and the American people were watching. Town halls across the country became packed. Citizens demanded answers. They wanted to know who else had stolen from them, who else had betrayed their trust. And in those crowded rooms, in those angry, grieving voices, something shifted. People remembered that they had power, that their voices mattered, that they could demand accountability. In a small church in Tennessee, a pastor named Reverend Thomas Grant stood before his congregation and spoke about J.D. Vance. That man, he said, his voice echoing through the wooden pews, reminded us that courage is not about being loud. It's about being true. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He just told the truth. And sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do. The congregation murmured in agreement. An elderly woman in the front row wiped tears from her face. Her grandson had died of COVID. She had always wondered if better funding, better resources could have saved him. Now she knew that the money had been there. It had just been stolen. In Washington, J.D. Vance walked through the Capitol building and something had changed. People stepped aside for him, not out of fear but out of respect. Other senators, even those who disagreed with him politically, nodded as he passed. One of them, a Democrat from New York, stopped him in the hallway. "I didn't vote for your ticket," the senator said quietly. "But what you did in that hearing, that was something." J.D. just nodded. Someone had to. The senator hesitated, then extended his hand. J.D. shook it. And in that moment, a tiny crack appeared in the wall of partisan division that had seemed so unbreakable. Back home in Ohio, J.D. finally had a weekend with his family. His wife greeted him at the door with a long hug. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She had watched the hearing. She had seen what it cost him. Their children ran up, excited to have their father home. They didn't understand the magnitude of what had happened. To them, he was just dad. That night after the kids were asleep, J.D. sat on his back porch looking out at the dark fields beyond his property. His wife joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, she spoke. "Was it worth it?" she asked softly. J.D. thought about Jennifer Cole and her husband, about Rebecca Martinez and her restaurant, about the nurses and the teachers and the small business owners. "Yes," he said. "It was worth it." She rested her head on his shoulder. "Good, because they're going to come after you now, you know that." He nodded. "I know," she smiled in the darkness. "Then we'll be ready." And they sat there together, two people from a small town in Ohio, preparing for a battle they never wanted but would not run from. Across the nation, candles continued to burn in windows. Signs remained on lawns. The movement that had begun in a Senate hearing room was spreading, quietly, steadily. It wasn't organized. There was no leader, no headquarters. It was just people remembering that truth mattered, that integrity mattered, that someone somewhere was still willing to fight for them. In her apartment in California, Rebecca Martinez finally reopened the folder containing her business loan denial letters. She had kept them, unable to throw them away, as if discarding them would mean accepting defeat. Now she spread them out on her kitchen table and took a photograph. She posted it online with a simple caption. "They said there was no money, but there was. It was just stolen. Thank you, J.D. Vance, for proving I wasn't the failure. The system was." The post was shared 10,000 times in an hour, 50,000 by morning, 1,000,000 by the end of the week. And with each share, another person told their story. Another name joined the chorus. The invisible became visible. The forgotten became remembered. In his Senate office, Adam Schiff sat alone in the dark. His phone was off. His staff had abandoned him. The walls that had once been covered with photos of him shaking hands with presidents and celebrities were now bare. His attorneys had advised him not to speak, not to move, not to do anything that might worsen his legal position. So he sat, and he thought about the moment it had all unraveled. That single sentence. "While you mock my role, your name appears on this document." He had underestimated J.D. Vance, thought him weak, thought him irrelevant, and in that miscalculation he had destroyed himself. Schiff thought about his career, the committees he had chaired, the investigations he had led, the power he had wielded, all of it gone in an instant because he had gotten greedy, because he had believed himself untouchable, because he had forgotten that truth eventually always finds its way out. He didn't feel remorse, not really. He felt angry, cheated, as if he had been playing a game everyone else was playing and he had simply been caught while others had not. But he knew that excuse wouldn't save him. Nothing would save him now. Meanwhile, federal investigators were working around the clock. They had seized Schiff's financial records. They had interviewed dozens of witnesses. The case was airtight, and it was expanding. 3 other members of Congress were now under investigation. 2 had already resigned quietly, hopping to avoid prosecution. The third, a senator from Illinois, was defiant, claiming innocence even as his assets were frozen. The media frenzy continued unabated. Every news cycle brought new revelations. A former Schiff staffer came forward with recordings of conversations where Schiff discussed moving money to avoid detection. Another whistleblower provided documents showing that Schiff had pressured officials to approve fraudulent relief applications for companies that didn't exist. And through it all, J.D. Vance remained quiet. He gave no interviews. He made no victory laps. He simply returned to his duties as vice president, attending meetings, casting tie-breaking votes, representing the administration at events. But everywhere he went, people approached him, not politicians or donors, but ordinary citizens. A janitor at the Capitol stopped him to shake his hand. "My sister lost her bakery," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for caring." A park ranger in Wyoming sent him a letter. "I never thought anyone in Washington gave a damn about people like us. You proved me wrong." A retired teacher in Maine baked him cookies and mailed them with a note. "For the man who reminded us that heroes still exist." JD kept every letter. He read every one. And late at night, when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he would pull them out and read them again, reminding himself why it had been worth it, why it would always be worth it. In a maximum security conference room at the Department of Justice, prosecutors laid out their case against Adam Schiff. The evidence covered an entire wall: timelines, wire transfers, shell company registries, witness statements. It was overwhelming. The lead prosecutor, a woman named Sandra Ling, stood back and surveyed the wall. "This is the most documented case of congressional corruption I've ever seen," she said. Her assistant nodded. "He's going to prison, no question." Sandra didn't smile. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy, a betrayal of public trust on a scale that would take years to repair. The trial date was set for 6 months out. Schiff's attorneys filed motion after motion, trying to delay, trying to suppress evidence, trying anything to slow the inevitable. But the judge, a no-nonsense federal appointee named Harold Chen, denied them all. "The American people deserve a swift resolution to this matter," he stated from the bench. "Justice delayed is justice denied." As the trial approached, the nation remained fixated. It was all anyone talked about. In barbershops and grocery stores, at PTA meetings and office water coolers, people debated the case. Most wanted Schiff convicted. Some, a dwindling minority, claimed it was a political witch hunt. But the evidence was too strong, the documents too clear. Even Schiff's most ardent defenders began to quietly distance themselves. Through it all, J.D. Vance prepared for the possibility that he would be called as a witness. He reviewed his testimony over and over, not to change it, but to ensure he remembered every detail. His attorney advised him to be prepared for aggressive cross-examination. "They're going to try to make this about you," the lawyer warned. "They'll claim you had political motivations." JD just nodded. "Let them. The evidence speaks for itself." And he was right. When the trial finally began, the prosecution's case was devastating. They presented the audit report that JD had revealed in the Senate. They called the whistleblowers who had come forward. They showed the bank records, the wire transfers, the emails. The defense had nothing. Schiff's attorneys tried to claim he had been misled by his staff, that he hadn't known where the money was going. But the emails proved otherwise. In his own words, Schiff had discussed hiding the funds, creating the shell companies, and silencing anyone who asked questions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts: wire fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice. The courtroom erupted. Schiff sat motionless, his face pale, as the verdict was read. His wife, sitting in the gallery, covered her face and sobbed. The judge set sentencing for 30 days out but remanded Schiff to custody immediately. He was led out in handcuffs, and for the first time he looked small, diminished, human. The news spread instantly. Guilty, convicted, justice served. Across America, people who had been wronged felt something they hadn't felt in years: vindication, not revenge, just the simple, powerful knowledge that someone had been held accountable. In her apartment, Rebecca Martinez watched the verdict on her phone and cried, not from sadness but from relief. It had been real. The corruption had been real, and someone had actually paid for it. In Ohio, J.D. Vance was in a meeting when his assistant slipped him a note. "Verdict is in. Guilty." He read it, nodded once, and returned to his meeting. He didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat, because this wasn't about Schiff. It was about everyone Schiff had hurt, and no verdict could undo that pain. That night, J.D. received a call from President Trump. "You did good, kid," Trump said. "You did real good." J.D. was quiet for a moment. "I just told the truth, sir," Trump chuckled. "That's the hardest thing to do in this town, but you did it, and people won't forget." After he hung up, J.D. sat alone in his office. The building was quiet. Most of the staff had gone home. He thought about the past months, the hearing, the investigation, the trial. All of it had started with one decision: to speak up, to risk everything, to trust that the truth would matter. And it had, but at what cost? His phone buzzed, a text message from a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, but something made him open it. The message was simple. "My name is David Cole. You don't know me, but you knew my wife, Jennifer. She reached out to you after my brother died. He was the one who took his life after his business failed. I just wanted you to know that because of what you did, I finally understand that it wasn't his fault. He didn't fail. He was failed. And that changes everything. It doesn't bring him back, but it gives me peace. Thank you." JD read the message 3 times. Then he set his phone down, put his head in his hands, and let the tears come. For David's brother, for Jennifer, for every family torn apart by greed and corruption, and for the truth that had finally been told. He sat there for a long time in the darkness. Outside, the city lights of Washington glowed cold and distant. But somewhere out there, in homes and apartments across America, people were breathing easier, sleeping better, believing again. And that, JD thought, was enough. It had to be enough. The sentencing hearing came on a gray October morning. The courtroom was packed. Victims of Schiff's fraud had traveled from across the country to be there. They wanted to see justice done. They wanted to look him in the eye. Judge Chen entered and the room rose. Schiff was brought in, wearing a prison jumpsuit instead of his usual tailored suits. He looked older, broken. The judge wasted no time. "Mr. Schiff," he began, his voice firm, "you were entrusted with the welfare of the American people. During a time of unprecedented crisis, when your constituents were suffering, you chose personal enrichment over public service. You stole from those who had nothing, and you did so without remorse." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole." The courtroom gasped. 25 years, it was harsh even by federal standards, but Judge Chen continued. "Let this sentence serve as a message. Public corruption will not be tolerated. Betrayal of the public trust will be met with the full force of the law." He slammed his gavel. Court adjourned. Schiff's attorneys immediately filed an appeal, but everyone knew it was hopeless. The evidence was too damning. The conviction too clean. Adam Schiff would spend the next 2.5 decades behind bars. As he was led away, one of the victims, a woman who had lost her restaurant, stood and called out, "You stole my dream." Schiff didn't turn around. He just kept walking, head down, shoulders slumped. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Victims gave tearful statements. Prosecutors declared victory for justice. And somewhere in Washington, J.D. Vance watched the coverage silently. He felt no triumph, only a profound sadness that it had come to this. That a man had thrown away his entire life for money. That so many had suffered because of one person's greed. In the weeks that followed, the Justice Department expanded its investigation. The Illinois senator who had been defiant was also convicted. 2 congressional staffers pled guilty to lesser charges in exchange for cooperation. The web of corruption was unraveled thread by thread, and each revelation brought more pain, more anger, more demands for reform. Congress passed the Emergency Relief Accountability Act, a sweeping piece of legislation designed to prevent future fraud. It mandated independent audits, real-time tracking of funds, and severe criminal penalties for misuse. President Trump signed it in a Rose Garden ceremony, with J.D. Vance standing behind him. "This is for the people who were forgotten," Trump said. "This is to make sure it never happens again." But J.D. knew that laws alone wouldn't change the culture. That required something deeper, a shift in values, a return to the idea that public service was about serving, not enriching. And that shift had to start with individuals making hard choices, choosing truth over convenience, integrity over ambition. He wondered if he had started that shift, or if it had been there all along, waiting for someone to give it voice. Months passed. The news cycle moved on to other scandals, other crises. But the impact of that Senate hearing lingered. Schools began teaching about it in civics classes. Universities held symposiums analyzing the case. Documentaries were made. And in quiet conversations across America, people still talked about the moment when J.D. Vance stood up and told the truth. Rebecca Martinez, the restaurant owner from California, used the attention from her viral post to launch a nonprofit. It was called Second Chance Kitchens, and it helped other small business owners who had been denied relief funding get back on their feet. She partnered with local banks, community organizations, and volunteers. Within a year, they had helped over 300 businesses reopen. JD gave me hope, she told a local news station. Now I'm trying to pass that hope on. Jennifer Cole, the widow whose husband had taken his life, started speaking at high schools about mental health and the pressures of entrepreneurship. She talked openly about her loss, about the shame her husband had felt, about the system that had failed him. My husband wasn't weak, she told students in packed auditoriums. He was lied to, and that's not the same thing. Her honesty resonated. Teens who had never thought about these issues began asking questions, began demanding better from their leaders. And in Washington, Vance continued his work, quietly, without fanfare. He pushed for legislation to support small businesses. He visited communities that had been hardest hit by the pandemic. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, people listened, because they knew he had proven himself. He had done the hard thing when it mattered most. One afternoon, JD received an unexpected visitor. Martin Reeves, the elderly veteran who had saluted him in the Capitol hallway, had requested a meeting. JD welcomed him into his office personally, rising from behind his desk and crossing the room to shake the old man's hand. Martin moved slowly, his cane tapping against the marble floor, but his posture remained military straight. His eyes, though dimmed by age, still held that same fierce clarity that JD had noticed in their first encounter. "Mr. Vice President," Martin began, then caught himself. "JD, if I may, I don't have much time left. Doctors gave me 6 months, maybe less. Cancer." He said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity. "I wanted to come here while I still could, to thank you properly." JD gestured for Martin to sit in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. He took the seat across from him, leaning forward, giving the veteran his full attention. "You don't owe me any thanks," JD said quietly. "You served this country for decades. I'm the one who should be thanking you." Martin shook his head, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. "You served too, in a different way. What you did in that hearing, that took a kind of courage most people don't have anymore." He paused, his hand trembling slightly as he adjusted his grip on the cane. "I fought in Vietnam, saw boys die in the mud, came home to people spitting on us, calling us baby killers. I watched politicians send us to hell and then pretend we didn't exist when we came back." His voice grew stronger, more urgent. "For 50 years I wondered if any of it meant anything, if the country I fought for still existed. And then I watched you stand up in that chamber and tell the truth when everyone else was lying. You didn't do it for votes. You didn't do it for power. You did it because it was right." Martin's eyes glistened. "You gave me my answer, son. The country is still there. It's just been sleeping, and you woke it up." They talked for nearly 2 hours. Martin told stories JD had never heard, tales of bureaucratic corruption even in the military, of supplies that never arrived because someone had diverted them for profit, of benefits denied to veterans because the paperwork had mysteriously disappeared. "It's been going on forever," Martin said, "but nobody talks about it. Nobody wants to be the one to rock the boat." JD listened, absorbing every word, and as Martin spoke, a realization crystallized in his mind. The corruption he had exposed with Schiff wasn't an anomaly. It was a symptom of a much deeper disease. A system that had, over decades, normalized graft and self-dealing. A culture that rewarded loyalty to power over service to people. "What do I do about it?" JD asked finally. "How do you fight something that big?" Martin was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "You keep doing exactly what you're doing. You tell the truth, every single time, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you, because the truth is like water on stone. It doesn't work all at once, but over time it wears everything down." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. "I've been keeping records for 40 years. Names, dates, incidents I witnessed, things that were covered up or swept under the rug." He handed the notebook to JD. "I want you to have this. Maybe some of it will be useful, maybe not, but I trust you to do the right thing with it." JD took the notebook, feeling the weight of it. Not the physical weight, which was negligible, but the weight of decades of witnessing and recording injustice. "Martin," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything," Martin replied. "Just promise me something. When they come after you, and they will, don't back down, don't compromise, don't let them convince you that the truth is negotiable." He stood slowly, steadying himself with his cane. "And remember that you're not alone. There are millions of us out here. We can't all stand in that chamber like you did, but we're standing with you, always." JD walked Martin to the door. As they shook hands one final time, the old veteran pulled him into an embrace. "You're the son I wish I'd had," Martin whispered. "Make me proud." Then he was gone, walking slowly down the hallway, his cane echoing against the floor until the sound faded away. JD returned to his desk and opened the notebook. Page after page of meticulous handwriting. Incidents from military bases, congressional hearings, backroom deals. It was a chronicle of corruption spanning half a century. And as he read, JD understood that Martin had given him more than just information. He had given him a mission, a responsibility to carry forward what one veteran had spent a lifetime documenting. That night, JD stayed late in his office, reading through Martin's notes. Some of the incidents were small, petty corruption that had hurt individual soldiers or contractors. Others were massive, involving billions of dollars and decisions that had cost lives. Each entry was dated and detailed, written in the careful hand of someone who knew that someday, somehow, this record might matter. One entry caught his attention. It was from 1991, during the first Gulf War. Martin had documented how a shipment of body armor, desperately needed by troops on the front lines, had been delayed for weeks because a defense contractor had paid off an Army logistics officer to prioritize a different, less urgent shipment. By the time the body armor arrived, 3 soldiers had been killed in an ambush. Their deaths, Martin noted, were ruled as combat casualties. No investigation was ever launched into the delayed shipment. JD felt rage building in his chest. Not the hot, explosive kind, but the cold, determined kind. The kind that doesn't fade. These weren't just statistics or policy failures. These were lives. Real people with families and dreams who had been sacrificed on the altar of someone else's greed. And nobody had been held accountable. Nobody had even asked the questions. He picked up his phone and called Patricia Morales, the Attorney General. It was nearly midnight, but she answered on the second ring. "JD," she said, alert despite the hour. "What's going on?" "I need to see you tomorrow morning," JD said. "I have something. Evidence of systematic corruption going back decades. I think we've only scratched the surface with Schiff." There was a pause. Then Patricia's voice came back, serious and focused. "How solid is this evidence?" "It's documented by a military veteran over 40 years. Names, dates, specifics. I don't know how much of it we can still prosecute, but it shows a pattern, a culture, and it's still happening." "Bring it to my office at 7, Patricia said. "And JD, be careful who you tell about this. If what you're saying is true, you're about to make a lot of very powerful people very nervous." JD hung up and returned to the notebook. He read until his eyes burned, until the words began to blur, and with each page his resolve hardened. This wasn't about one congressman anymore. This was about transforming an entire system, and he knew with absolute certainty that it would try to destroy him for it. The meeting with Patricia Morales the next morning was intense. JD brought the notebook, and together they went through it section by section. Patricia's team of prosecutors joined them, and as they read, their expressions shifted from skepticism to shock to grim determination. "This is unprecedented," one of the prosecutors said finally. "If even half of this is verifiable, we're looking at the largest corruption investigation in American history." Patricia nodded slowly. "We need to be strategic. We can't just dump this on the public. It'll cause panic, accusations of witch hunts. We need to investigate quietly, build cases, and then move decisively." She looked at JD. "Are you prepared for what this means? The moment we start pulling these threads, every powerful person in Washington is going to turn on you." "I know," JD said, "but I also know what happens if we don't. More people get hurt, more families lose everything, more veterans die waiting for benefits that were stolen from them." He paused. Martin died 3 days ago. His daughter called me yesterday. He held on long enough to give me this notebook and then he let go. I'm not going to let that be for nothing. The room fell silent. Then Patricia stood and extended her hand. Then let's get to work. Over the following months, the Justice Department launched dozens of quiet investigations. They subpoenaed records. They interviewed witnesses. They followed money trails that crisscrossed the country and disappeared into offshore accounts. And slowly, methodically, they built cases. Not just against individuals, but against the networks and systems that had enabled corruption to flourish. JD continued his public duties, giving speeches, attending events, representing the administration. But beneath the surface, he was working with prosecutors, providing context and connections from Martin's notebook. He introduced them to other veterans who had witnessed similar things. He helped them understand the culture and relationships that made the corruption possible. And as the investigations progressed, word began to leak out. Rumors spread through Washington. Powerful lobbyists started making calls, trying to find out what was happening. Congressional offices went into defensive mode, shredding documents and scrubbing emails. The establishment sensed danger, and it began to circle its wagons. Then came the first arrest. A former Pentagon official, now working as a defense contractor, was charged with accepting over $3 million in bribes to steer contracts to specific companies. The evidence was overwhelming, taken directly from Martin's notebook and corroborated by financial records. The contractor pled guilty within a week, hoping for leniency. And in his plea agreement, he named names. Lots of names. The dominoes began to fall. A sitting congressman from Virginia was indicted for taking kickbacks from the same contractor. A retired Army general was charged with fraud. A prominent lobbyist turned himself in before charges were even filed, bringing with him a hard drive full of incriminating documents he had kept as insurance. The media exploded. Headlines screamed about widespread corruption. Talking heads debated whether this was justice or a politically motivated purge. But the evidence was too strong to dismiss. These weren't vague allegations. They were specific, documented crimes with paper trails and witnesses. And at the center of it all was J.D. Vance. Not because he was seeking attention, but because everyone knew he was the catalyst. The one who had refused to look away. The one who had taken an old veteran's notebook and turned it into accountability. The backlash was fierce. Anonymous sources began leaking negative stories about JD to the press. Old quotes were taken out of context. Former colleagues suddenly remembered disagreements and conflicts. A super PAC launched attack ads accusing him of being on a vendetta, of using the Justice Department as a political weapon. JD expected it, but it still hurt. He received death threats. His family's home in Ohio required round-the-clock security. His wife had to stop taking the kids to their regular activities because protesters showed up, shouting accusations. The pressure was immense, crushing. One night after a particularly brutal day of hearings and press attacks, JD sat alone in his office, wondering if he had made a mistake, if the cost was too high. His phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Vice President," a woman's voice said, hesitant. "My name is Sarah Kemper. You don't know me, but my father served with Martin Reeves in Vietnam. Martin called him a few weeks before he died and told him what he'd given you. My father wanted me to call and tell you something." "What's that?" JD asked, his voice tired. "He said to tell you that courage is never convenient, that if it was easy, everyone would do it, and that the attacks you're facing prove you're doing something that matters." She paused. "My father is dying too. Same cancer as Martin. He doesn't have long, but he wanted you to know that you're not alone, that there are thousands of us who see what you're doing and are praying for you every single day." JD felt tears well up. "Thank you," he managed. "Tell your father, tell him thank you for his service, and tell him I won't quit." "He knows," Sarah said softly. "That's why he wanted me to call." After she hung up, JD sat in the darkness for a long time. The attacks would continue. The pressure would intensify. But Sarah's call reminded him that for every powerful person trying to tear him down, There were 100 ordinary people holding him up, and that was enough. It had to be enough. The investigations continued to expand. By the end of the year, over 40 people had been indicted. The charges ranged from bribery and fraud to conspiracy and money laundering. Some pled guilty. Others fought the charges, hiring expensive attorneys and trying to use political connections to make the cases disappear. But Patricia Morales and her team were relentless. They had the evidence, they had the witnesses, and they had the will to see it through. One of the most shocking indictments came in February. A senior senator, someone who had been in Congress for over 30 years and was considered untouchable, was charged with running a scheme that had defrauded military families of over $20 million. He had used his position on the Armed Services Committee to direct contracts to companies he secretly owned. The money that should have gone to building better housing for soldiers and their families had instead been diverted to his personal accounts. The senator held a defiant press conference, claiming innocence and political persecution. But within weeks, evidence emerged that demolished his defense. Emails, bank statements, testimony from his own former chief of staff. The public turned on him instantly. Veterans groups that had once supported him now demanded his resignation. His approval rating collapsed, and 3 months later he resigned in disgrace, just days before the trial was set to begin. Each new indictment, each new revelation vindicated J.D.'s decision to pursue this. But it also took its toll. He looked older. The lines around his eyes deepened. His hair started to gray at the temples. Friends worried about him. His wife urged him to slow down, to delegate more, but he couldn't. This was personal now, for Martin, for Sarah's father, for every person who had been betrayed by the system. In a small town in Pennsylvania, a woman named Gloria Hutchins watched the news coverage with tears streaming down her face. Her son had died in Iraq. He had been riding in a vehicle that lacked proper armor because the money for upgrades had been diverted. She had spent 15 years trying to get answers, filing Freedom of Information requests, calling congressional offices, writing letters. Nobody had listened. Nobody had cared. But now, watching these powerful people being held accountable, she felt something shift inside her. Not closure exactly. Her son was still gone, but validation. Proof that she hadn't been crazy, that the system really had failed him, and that someone finally was making it right. Gloria picked up the phone and called J.D. Vance's office. She didn't expect to reach him. She just wanted to leave a message. But to her shock, after explaining who she was and why she was calling, she was told to hold. 2 minutes later, J.D.'s voice came on the line. "Mrs. Hutchins," he said gently, "I'm so sorry for your loss." Gloria couldn't speak for a moment. Then she said, I needed you to know that what you're doing matters. My son died because someone stole the money that could have saved him. And for 15 years, nobody cared. But you care. You're making them pay. And thank you for giving my son's death meaning. J.D.'s voice was thick with emotion when he responded. Your son's death always had meaning, Mrs. Hutchins. He served with honor. What I'm doing is just trying to make sure the people who failed him face consequences. But your son's sacrifice, that stands on its own. They talked for 20 minutes. J.D. listened as Gloria told stories about her son, about his childhood, his decision to join the military, the letters he had sent home. And when they finally said goodbye, J.D. sat at his desk and wept. For Gloria's son. For all the sons and daughters and husbands and wives who had paid the ultimate price while others profited. That night he added Gloria's name to a list he had been keeping, a list of people he was fighting for, people who had been hurt by the corruption he was working to expose. The list was now over 300 names long, and each name represented a story, a life, a family, a loss that should never have happened. As spring arrived, the political landscape in Washington had fundamentally changed. The old guard, the powerful insiders who had operated with impunity for decades, were now on the defensive. Committee assignments were shuffled. Leadership positions were vacated. A culture of accountability began to take root, slowly, painfully, but unmistakably. J.D. received an invitation to speak at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The organization hosting the event wanted him to give the keynote address on Memorial Day. He almost declined. He wasn't a veteran. He hadn't served in combat. Who was he to speak at such a sacred place? But then he thought about Martin, about the notebook, about the responsibility that had been passed to him, and he accepted. Memorial Day dawned gray and humid. Thousands of veterans and their families gathered at the wall, that long black granite monument inscribed with the names of the fallen. JD stood at the podium looking out at the sea of faces. Old men in worn jackets covered with patches and medals, widows clutching photographs, children who had never met their fathers. He felt the weight of their grief, their sacrifice, their expectations. He began to speak, his voice carrying across the memorial. "I didn't serve in combat," he said. "I can never truly understand what you've been through, what you've sacrificed, but I've spent the last year learning about something else, about how that sacrifice was betrayed, about how the resources meant to protect you were stolen, about how the benefits you earned were denied." He paused, letting his words sink in. "A veteran named Martin Reeves gave me a notebook before he died. In it, he had documented 40 years of corruption, of supplies that never arrived, of benefits that were stolen, of lives lost because someone chose profit over duty." JD's voice grew stronger. "And when I read that notebook, I made a promise that those betrayals would not be forgotten, that the people responsible would face justice, and that we would build a system worthy of your sacrifice." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "Over the past year, we've made progress. Dozens of people have been indicted. Millions of dollars have been recovered. Systems have been reformed. But this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. Because the culture that allowed this corruption to flourish didn't develop overnight, and it won't disappear overnight either." He looked directly at the veterans in the front rows. "I'm asking for your help, your voices, your stories, because change doesn't come from Washington, it comes from you. From people who refuse to accept corruption as normal, who demand that their leaders actually lead, who remember that public service means sacrifice, not enrichment." JD finished his speech and stepped back from the podium. For a moment there was silence. Then one by one the veterans began to stand. They saluted, not the formal military salute but the gesture of respect, of recognition. And as JD looked out at them, at these men and women who had given so much, he felt something break open inside him. Not pain, but purpose, renewed and absolute. After the ceremony, dozens of veterans approached him. They shook his hand. They shared their stories. They thanked him. And many of them, like Martin had done, gave him information. Names of people involved in corruption they had witnessed. Details of incidents that had been covered up. By the end of the day, JD had filled an entire folder with leads for investigators to follow. That evening, as he flew back to Washington, JD looked out the window of Air Force Two at the country spread below him. Farmland and cities, rivers and mountains, all of it beautiful, all of it worth fighting for. He thought about the long road ahead, the battles yet to come, the people who would try to stop him, and he felt ready, because he wasn't fighting alone. He never had been. The summer brought new challenges. Several of the defendants who had been indicted launched a coordinated counterattack. They hired crisis management firms. They appeared on friendly news networks, claiming they were victims of a political vendetta. They filed lawsuits against the Justice Department, alleging prosecutorial misconduct. They pressured congressional allies to launch investigations into the investigations. The strategy was clear: create so much noise and confusion that the public would lose track of the actual evidence. Make it seem like both sides were equally corrupt, equally dishonest. Muddy the waters until people gave up trying to figure out the truth. It was a tactic as old as politics itself, and it often worked. But this time, something was different. The public had seen the evidence. They had heard the testimonies. They had watched Adam Schiff crumble under the weight of his own corruption. And they weren't buying the deflections. Social media erupted with posts calling out the coordinated attacks. Ordinary citizens started fact-checking the claims being made by the defendants and posting corrections. A grassroots movement emerged, demanding that the investigations continue. JD watched this unfold with a mixture of hope and caution. Grassroots movements were powerful, but they could also be fleeting. The challenge was to channel that energy into lasting change. He began working with reform-minded members of Congress, both Republican and Democrat, to draft comprehensive anti-corruption legislation. The bill they crafted was ambitious. It mandated independent oversight of all emergency spending. It created severe criminal penalties for officials who misused public funds. It established whistleblower protections and rewards, and it banned former members of Congress from lobbying for 10 years after leaving office. The legislation faced immediate opposition. Lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill in force. They wined and dined lawmakers, arguing that the bill was too extreme, that it would make government unworkable. They threatened to fund primary challenges against anyone who supported it. They deployed every tool in their arsenal to kill the bill before it could gain momentum. But JD had learned something from the Schiff affair. Sunlight was the best disinfectant. So instead of negotiating behind closed doors, he took the fight public. He held town halls across the country, explaining the legislation in plain language. He appeared on news programs, armed with specific examples of how corruption had hurt real people. He used social media to share stories from victims of fraud. And slowly, the tide began to turn. Lawmakers who had initially been skeptical started receiving calls from constituents demanding they support the bill. Town halls that had been scheduled as routine events became packed with passionate citizens. The grassroots movement found a concrete goal to rally around. Within 3 months, the bill had enough co-sponsors to guarantee passage in the House. The Senate would be harder, but it was no longer impossible. The vote was scheduled for September. As the date approached, the attacks on JD intensified. Anonymous sources leaked that he was being investigated for tax irregularities. The story was baseless, quickly debunked, but it still made headlines. Another leak claimed he had used campaign funds inappropriately. Also false. Also headlines. The goal was clear: destroy his credibility before the vote. JD weathered the attacks in silence. He didn't respond to the allegations. He didn't hold defensive press conferences. He just kept working, kept pushing for the legislation, kept telling the truth. And his silence spoke louder than any rebuttal could have, because people saw through the tactics. They recognized desperation when they saw it. The night before the vote, JD couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The Senate hearing, Martin's notebook, the investigations, the indictments, all of it had been building toward this. A chance to actually change the system, to make corruption harder and accountability easier. But he also knew that passing a law was just the first step. Implementation would be the real battle. The next morning, he arrived at the Capitol early. The building was already buzzing with activity. Reporters lined the hallways. Protesters gathered outside, both supporters and opponents of the bill. JD made his way to the Senate chamber and took his seat. As vice president, he would preside over the debate and cast a tie-breaking vote if necessary. The debate lasted all day. Opponents of the bill argued that it was government overreach, that it would tie the hands of legitimate public servants, that it was a solution in search of a problem. Supporters countered with specific examples of corruption, citing case after case where the current system had failed. They read letters from victims. They showed financial records. They made the abstract concrete. As the sun began to set, the vote was called. JD watched as senators cast their ballots electronically. The tally appeared on screens around the chamber. Yes votes accumulated slowly, then faster. The final count came in, 49 to 49, a perfect tie, which meant it fell to JD to cast the deciding vote. The chamber fell silent. Every eye turned to him. This was the moment, the culmination of everything. JD stood slowly. He looked around the chamber at the senators, at the gallery packed with observers. Then he spoke, his voice clear and steady. In matters of public trust, there can be no halfway measures. The American people deserve leaders who serve them, not themselves. I vote yes. The chamber erupted, cheers from the gallery, groans from opponents. The gavel slammed, calling for order. But the deed was done. The bill had passed. Comprehensive anti-corruption legislation was now one step away from becoming law. It still needed the president's signature, but that was assured. Trump had already indicated he would sign it immediately. As JD left the chamber, he was mobbed by reporters. They shouted questions, asking how he felt, what this meant, whether he planned to run for higher office. He ignored them all and kept walking, because this wasn't about him. It had never been about him. It was about Martin and Gloria and Rebecca and Jennifer and every other person who had been betrayed by a system that was supposed to protect them. That night, JD returned to his office and found a package waiting on his desk. There was no return address, just his name written in shaky handwriting. He opened it carefully. Inside was a medal, a bronze star, and a letter. Vice President, the letter read. My name is Thomas Kemper. I served with Martin Reeves. My daughter Sarah called you several months ago. I'm writing this now because I probably won't be alive when you read it. The cancer is moving fast, but I wanted you to have this medal. I earned it in Vietnam, but I'm giving it to you because you've shown more courage in a suit than most men show in combat. You fought for us when we couldn't fight for ourselves. And you've reminded this country what honor means. Thank you and never stop. Thomas Kemper, Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired. JD held the medal in his hand, feeling its weight. He thought about Thomas and Martin and all the others who had served, who had sacrificed, who had believed in something bigger than themselves. And he made a silent vow. He would never stop, no matter what it cost. No matter how hard they came after him, he would keep fighting. Because that's what you did when someone handed you their bronze star. You carried it forward. You honored it with action. The president signed the anti-corruption bill into law 3 days later in a ceremony in the Rose Garden. JD stood behind him, along with the congressional leaders who had co-sponsored the legislation. Trump made a speech about draining the swamp and restoring integrity to government. The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. But JD barely heard any of it. His mind was elsewhere, already thinking about implementation, about the next battle, about the work still to be done. After the ceremony, he walked back to his office alone. The hallways of the West Wing were quiet. Most of the staff had gone to the celebration reception. JD preferred the solitude. He sat at his desk and pulled out Thomas Kemper's bronze star. He placed it next to Martin's notebook. These were his touchstones now, reminders of why he was here and what he was fighting for. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. You did good today, but this is just the beginning. They're going to come for you harder now. Be ready, a friend. JD stared at the message for a long moment. Then he deleted it and set his phone down. He knew the sender was right. The establishment he had challenged wasn't going to surrender. They would regroup. They would find new ways to resist. They would try to undermine the law, to create loopholes, to return to business as usual. But JD was ready, because he had learned something important over the past year. The system was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. It could be changed. Not easily, not quickly, but it could be changed. By people who refused to give up. By people who chose truth over comfort. By people who remembered that public service was a calling, not a career. As the sun set over Washington, casting long shadows across the monuments and buildings, JD Vance sat in his office and prepared for the next fight. Because there would always be a next fight. Always another corruption to expose. Always another injustice to confront. That was the nature of the work. But it was work worth doing. Work that mattered. Work that honored the sacrifice of men like Martin and Thomas. And somewhere in towns and cities across America, other people were making similar decisions, to speak up, to run for office, to hold their leaders accountable. The movement that had started with one Senate hearing was spreading, taking root, growing. It would face setbacks. It would encounter resistance. But it would continue. Because once people remembered their power, once they saw that change was possible, there was no going back. JD looked at the bronze star one more time. Then he placed it in his desk drawer next to Martin's notebook. These weren't trophies to display. They were sacred trusts, responsibilities, promises made to the living and the dead. And he intended to keep those promises every single day. For as long as he had the strength to stand. The work continued. The fight went on. And America slowly, painfully began to remember what it meant to be a nation of laws, not men. A country where justice wasn't a privilege but a right. Where power served people instead of preying on them. It was a long road. The destination was far, but the journey had begun. And JD Vance, a kid from Ohio who had never forgotten where he came from, was determined to see it through. Not for glory, not for power, but for Martin, for Thomas, for Gloria's son, for every forgotten American who deserved better. That was enough. That would always be enough. If this story moved something inside you, if you felt even a fraction of the courage that J.D. Vance showed, then don't let this moment pass without action. Hit that like button right now. Let this message spread to others who need to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell us, what would you do if you had J.D.'s opportunity? Would you risk everything for the truth? Share your thoughts, be part of the conversation, and subscribe to this channel because we need more stories like this. Stories that remind us what real leadership looks like. What happens when one person refuses to back down? What changes when courage meets truth? This is your moment. Don't stay silent. Let your voice matter.